Yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin made an announcement as unexpected as it was significant. What announcement? Basically, the formal declaration that Russia had successfully tested the unmanned underwater vehicle named Poseidon. This nuclear torpedo, known in Russia as the doomsday weapon, has a virtually unlimited range and a destructive power equivalent to 7,000 Hiroshima nuclear bombs. The announcement immediately triggered panic among Western leaders, to the point that US President Donald Trump has already responded by announcing the start of nuclear tests in the United States. On the brink. We appear to be on the brink of World War III. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Broadcasting from Buenos Aires, Argentina, we begin transmission number 277 of Demolishing Myths Live. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship. What a broadcast we have today. I'm going to adjust the camera a little lower. There we go. What a broadcast today about Putin's announcements yesterday, both regarding the successful test of the Poseidon nuclear torpedo and the Burevestnik nuclear missile, as well as the situation in Pokrovsk. Many announcements from Putin, all of them highly significant and provoking numerous reactions in the West. In addition to all this, today we're also going to present the meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, a meeting that, just as a preview, I would personally describe as a farce. That's why we'll only show it at the end. We'll also present the consequences of yesterday's Russian attack, with more than 700 drones targeting Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Once again, a terrible attack, with over 700 drones and missiles across Ukrainian territory, but this time with a particular twist, which we'll see after the main topic of this broadcast. By the way, Vladimir Putin's announcement from yesterday. Here are the images. Yesterday we presented a few things. Today we're going to present this in its entirety. But first I want to somehow put this announcement into context. I want to contextualize the global geopolitical situation of Russia, the United States, and China. And above all, this announcement regarding a new Russian superweapon. We're going to frame it with the background images, or maybe off to the side. The images released by Russia in 2019 when it presented its nuclear triad, in which, surprisingly, surely on purpose, but surprising nonetheless, for the first time they showed images of the Poseidon torpedo. They're going to appear within this video here at to my right, over here, within the frame of this video, almost just a fragment. When they begin, we'll make a note of the characteristics. But so far, these are the only images seen by the world in this 2019 video clip, a long time ago. So, let's begin the analysis of this situation. Once again, remembering that yesterday Putin announced an additional test, something truly unprecedented and very positive for Russia. Because up to now, Russia had carried out tests with the Poseidon torpedo there and so on. The project began a long time ago. In fact, some military analysts, some military historians, identify as a predecessor of this. This Poseidon torpedo, a project of the Soviet Union initiated in 1949 and later followed by successive projects, had never achieved an effective, successful launch. Therefore, the novelty here lies above all in the successful test of this unmanned underwater vehicle. That's how it's presented. We could simply call or categorize it as a nuclear torpedo, with nuclear characteristics in two senses. On one hand, its ability to carry a nuclear warhead, about whose power there are many versions, and on the other, because its explosive yield is estimated in multiple ranges, from 2 megatons to 100 megatons.
Desde 2 megatones hasta 100 megatones. Recuerden algo que la bomba de Hiroshima presenta.
Remember something. The Hiroshima bomb had an explosive power of around 15 kilotons. 15 kilotons. Well, here we would be witnessing an explosive power twice as great. In the case of 100 megatons, twice as powerful as the Tsar bomber. So far the most powerful nuclear bomb ever created in history, and dropped by the Russians in a nuclear test in 1961. Meanwhile, in the footage, we were just seeing the Russian strategic bombers, and now the intercontinental missiles, the Russian intercontinental strategic ballistic missiles. And in a moment, the first images of the Poseidon nuclear torpedo will appear.
Torpedo nuclear Poseidon. Capacidad nuclear entonces verdaderamente superlativa.
A truly superlative nuclear capability for this missile, but also something even more special, or more extraordinary still, its nuclear propulsion. A mini reactor 100 times smaller than the nuclear reactors used in nuclear-powered submarines. And this reactor produces something unprecedented so far. Basically autonomy, virtually unlimited range, because a nuclear reactor can generate energy for a very long time. And, according to the tests carried out by the Russians and the information released, this nuclear torpedo, could travel the seas for weeks or even months before striking a target.
Antes de acometer un objetivo. Este arma fue presentada públicamente.
This weapon was publicly presented, at least verbally, in a 2018 speech by Putin, that famous March 2018 State of the Nation address. Every year, Putin delivers the State of the Nation, and in 2018, he announced, though only orally, the ongoing development of 6 superweapons. Basically, the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, which is now deployed and fully developed, although at that time it was only announced. From 2018 to today, the Russians not only carried out successful tests, but have already put this missile into operation, replacing the old R-36 intercontinental ballistic missile. This is the first of the superweapons announced in that 2018 speech. On the other hand, Putin accompanied this announcement with that of the hypersonic atmospheric re-entry vehicle known as Avangard. This is basically a missile within a missile, a warhead that can be attached in some way to the Sarmat missile, its predecessor the R-36, or another intercontinental ballistic missile. Once in the air, it descends at a hypersonic speed even greater than that of the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, which reaches around Mach 20. Already hypersonic, already undetectable, already impossible to shoot down. Well, but this Avangard re-entry vehicle also has the capability. And over here, to my right, the images have just appeared. This one right here, the Poseidon torpedo. Pay attention to the size of that torpedo, about 20 meters long and 2 meters in diameter. The missile, the blades there directly, blurred as they say, deliberately out of focus, so as not to give any clues to the enemy. Those are the only images released so far, from which Western military analysts and pseudo-analysts make their speculations. In general, they presented this as a fantasy, like a cardboard model. Well, a cardboard model. Putin had already presented it, but he was putting it in context within the framework of that 2018 announcement. So the Sarmat missile, already in service, already deployed, the Avangard re-entry vehicle, designed precisely to be mounted on the Sarmat missile and to re-enter at a speed greater than Mach 20, following a non-ballistic, unpredictable trajectory. As a result, these Sarmat missiles, with Avangard atmospheric re-entry vehicles, basically create an indestructible weapon, at least against current anti-missile systems. Those were the first 2 weapons announced by Putin at the time. Then came the Kinzhal, also already in service and used, how many times now, in Ukraine. That same speech also mentioned the Burevestnik missile, which was recently announced again, or whose successful tests Putin presented just a week ago. The Torpedo, the nuclear Poseidon torpedo, that one as well. So, Sarmat, Avangard, Kinzel, Brevesnik, and Poseidon. Yes, that speech also included an anti-satellite laser weapon called Perisvet, although regarding that weapon, only speculations and rumors abound. It has not yet been publicly presented. And shortly afterward, in addition to those 6 superweapons announced in that speech, 2 new weapons appeared, also considered by many to be superweapons. Once again, in that speech, initially 6 superweapons were announced. Today, military analysts refer to 8 superweapons, adding 2 more that were announced later.
Armas adicionales más anunciadas posteriormente, una de ellas el misil Zircon.
One of them, the Zircon missile. It's a cruise missile, but also hypersonic. Remember that weapons with a speed greater than Mach 5 are called hypersonic. This one is also operational, from back then until now. It wasn't just an announcement and tests, but in this case, they also made it an operational missile, deployed and already used in Ukraine. And finally, another superweapon never announced by Putin until its use in Ukraine, the Oreshnik hypersonic missile.
El misil hipersónico Oreshnik. ¿Sí? Esas las 8, en realidad las 6 anunciadas en 2010.
Those are the 8. In fact, the 6 announced in 2018 and 2 announced later. Those are the 8 superweapons, whose development obviously began before Putin's 2018 speech. No one can set an exact date, but if you want my opinion, the turning point. The moment when Putin determined that all his efforts to reach out to the West and to achieve peaceful coexistence seemed truly doomed to failure, came as the West rejected Russia's proposals to participate in NATO and in the missile defense shield promoted by President Putin.
Escudo misilístico impulsado por el presidente George W. Bush,
George W. Bush, etc., regarding Russia's proposals about halting NATO expansion. Well, between Putin's speech at the 2007 Security Conference and the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, when, incredibly, NATO designated Georgia and Ukraine as future members, without a specific date but still as inevitable future members. This was established in 2008. In fact, they wanted to set a date for their admission, but thanks to the involvement of Merkel and Sarkozy, who rejected George W. Bush's plan as madness, they managed to reach an agreement and announced the future accession of those 2 countries.
Promulgaron el ingreso a futuro de estos 2 países. Bueno, para mí es el momento en el cual Putin determinó hasta aquí.
Well, for me, it was the moment when Putin said, "That's it, ladies and gentlemen." And of course, later, with the Maidan coup in 2014, they surely accelerated the development of all these weapons. He only presented them orally in his State of the Union address in 2018. To this day, 8 years later, the vast majority of these weapons have not only been shown with images and specifications, but have actually been deployed at their respective sites and are taking part in the war in Ukraine, with the exception of that anti-satellite laser system, about which only rumors have circulated so far. That's the story of these weapons. The last of them, the Poseidon torpedo, was presented again yesterday, or at least its successful tests were shown.
Presentado en cuanto a sus pruebas exitosas ayer. Presenta este misil además, perdón, lo llamo misil permanente.
I present this missile. Sorry, I keep calling it a missile because this torpedo actually resembles a missile in terms of its capabilities. But I'm not going to correct every one of my mistakes. It's not a missile through the air, but a torpedo under the water, even though it has similar characteristics to a missile. This torpedo, then, reaches a depth of 1,000 meters, which puts it beyond all submarine detection systems developed so far. Yesterday, we made a mistake when presenting it during the briefing, obviously from the operations floor. Not 500 meters as we said yesterday, but 1,000 meters below sea level.
1,000 metros bajo el nivel del mar. Un submarino militar puede descender en un caso.
A military submarine can descend, in a rather extreme case, to 600 meters below sea level. Some reach quite a bit less than that, 500 meters, 450 meters. Well, in extreme cases, up to 600 meters. Up to that depth, radar systems can, at least in theory, determine the existence or detection of a submarine. Well, this torpedo can descend to a depth of up to 1,000 meters and travel the seas for weeks or even months. And not only that, but it also reaches an unheard of speed for a torpedo, around 100 nautical knots, equivalent to 185 kilometers per hour. 185 kilometers per hour underwater, a real madness. The intended targets for this missile, logically, are located along the coasts.
Para este misil, lógicamente aparecen en las costas. Puertos, ciudades, bases navales,
Ports, cities, naval bases, industrial centers. And of course, with a 100 megaton warhead, it could not only cause the direct destruction of these targets, but also trigger a tsunami. It is also rumored, though unconfirmed, to have the capability of producing an explosion with a so-called cobalt bomb, which would cause terrible radioactive contamination in that tsunami and render the entire affected area contaminated for decades. For decades, vast areas. For example, if, God forbid, Russia were to carry out an attack against the United Kingdom. God forbid, because here we stand for peace, for humanism, and we wish death upon no one beyond our own strength.
Queremos la muerte de nadie, más allá de nuestras pocas simpatías por los señores.
Little sympathy for the British warlords, but beyond that, if Russia were to carry out an attack against the United Kingdom, all the areas affected by that tsunami, coastal zones stretching for several kilometers, would become uninhabitable for decades. This is the level of destruction possible with a nuclear warhead of this kind. A tsunami and the radioactive contamination linked to those cobalt bombs apparently included in this torpedo. As for the history of this missile, we can show here the footage of Putin's announcement. We'll present the full announcement later, along with the transcript, because of the importance of what Putin said. But for now, I'll just show the image of Putin with the soldiers recovering in a military hospital.
Soldados en recuperación en un hospital militar. La historia retrocede hasta...
The story goes back to the late 1940s, specifically to a project known as Project T-15, developed between 1949 and 1955, still under Stalin, in the midst of the Cold War. Basically, its goal was to create a large nuclear torpedo, intended logically for an attack on the US coast. But of course, that nuclear torpedo had a problem. It was so large that no submarine of the time could carry it. That's why it was abandoned. However, in the 1960s, the project was revived with a different concept, though with the same objective.
Distinta, aunque con el mismo objetivo, en lugar de generar un torpedo nuclear.
Instead of developing a giant nuclear torpedo aimed at attacking the coasts of the United States, they decided to begin work on a giant nuclear submarine, with the possibility of a direct impact, not from a torpedo, but from the submarine itself. Of course, that would have required kamikaze pilots, suicide pilots, because at that time, in the 1960s, engineers lacked the remote control capabilities we can achieve today through drones or unmanned underwater vehicles. Well, that other project was also quite delusional and was eventually abandoned.
Ese otro proyecto también bastante delirante y fue abandonado. Sin embargo, todo esto fue generando de alguna manera el acervo técnico.
However, all of this gradually generated, in some way, the technical foundation for the restart or re-emergence of this idea, according to many sources, around the year 2010. This would support our analysis that, in our opinion, Putin determined that his attempts to approach the West were doomed to fail, and that therefore, he had to begin developing defensive weapons in response to the advances of the United States and NATO toward the Russian border. If that process, in Putin's mind, more or less took shape between 2007 and 2008, the rumors about the start of the development of this Poseidon torpedo in 2010 would more or less make sense.
La plataforma de lanzamiento
the launch platform of... In 2010, a little more about the history, some important dates. In 2010, apparently the beginning of development. In 2018, the announcement in the already mentioned Putin speech, in March 2018, in the State of the Union address. And in 2019, the first images released by Russia, and so far the only ones. Once again, the images shown a little while ago. Here we present them again. A few brief ones, some images here, they'll appear there. Some images of this missile under construction in 2019. Up to now, up to 2025, nothing else, no announcements of any kind. And according to military analysts, Russia is believed to have conducted tests in the Barents Sea since its announcement, from 2018 to the present day. Failed tests. Here are the images. Once again, failed tests. That's why Putin's announcement yesterday about a successful test and the start of production of this missile and its entry into service is so important. These are the only images shown of the Torpedo. Once again, I called it a missile, my apologies, of this Poseidon torpedo. As for the possible launch platforms for this torpedo, well, first of all, there's the Belgorod submarine. This is the most modern and largest submarine in Russia and in the world. Given its characteristics and the current size of these submarines, it could carry a load of 6 Poseidon torpedoes in its bays.
Poseidon en sus bodegas. Además, Rusia ya comenzó la construcción de 2 submarinos.
In addition, Russia has already begun building 2 submarines slightly smaller than the Belgorod class. Also, of course, nuclear, but somewhat smaller. These could also carry a payload of 6 Poseidon torpedoes. And to round out this context, these torpedoes, and this is the key point, which is why I wanted to start by framing all this within the geopolitical situation, arose from Russia's attempt to approach the West, its rejection, and Putin's eventual decision to develop independent and autonomous defense alternatives in response to that rejection by the West. The peace agreements, the search for coexistence, and the effort to establish a mutually agreed Eurasian security framework, all these torpedoes and this type of weapon fall outside the New START treaties, contrary to non-proliferation agreements, which basically still, for a little while longer, set, or still set, a limit on deployed nuclear warheads, as well as on aerial launches, in the case of bombers, though not for fighters or fighter bombers. And in the case of submarine launchers, submarines, as well as land-based launchers, the mobile land-based launchers, and even silos too, but not the transportable or rail mobile launchers. The treaty includes a great many details and sets out a lot of restrictions. Thanks to these restrictions, in fact, not only to the restrictions of the New START treaty, but above all to those of the original treaty, START Y, negotiations for START II then began. It was enacted, but it never obtained ratification from the respective countries. Therefore, it was never established. Later, negotiations began as an attempt to replace it with START III, but they were never able to reach an agreement. In the end, as a sort of last-minute replacement, they established New START, which accompanied that original START treaty with this reduction in warheads, leading to an effective decrease in the number of deployed nuclear warheads in the United States and Russia. 1,500 deployed warheads, plus the undeployed ones, and around 700 submarine launchers and 700 bomber aircraft launchers. Not fighter bombers, though. Anyway, this type of Poseidon torpedo falls outside that treaty, which clearly aligns with Russia's goal of re-establishing nuclear deterrence after multiple violations and provocations from the West, both in terms of having unilaterally abandoned many agreements and in the provocations stemming from the military advance from the West toward China. The Russian border with Ukraine being the latest element of this advance. Well, this precisely responds to the effort to create nuclear deterrence beyond anything that has existed so far. Let's now present Putin's words in full, because he not only made this announcement, but also introduced several very interesting points regarding the Burevestnik missiles and the military situation at the front, particularly concerning the situation in Pokrovsk. Here are Putin's words. with your patience. All of this took place yesterday at the Mandrika Central Military Clinical Hospital in Moscow. And Putin begins his address as follows. The doctor just mentioned that all of you have injuries. I want to emphasize something I've said many times before, and I say it consciously and with full conviction. Everyone who is in the special military operations zone, on the front, in the war, is a hero. An attack can happen at any time and in any place. However, assault units, special forces, and high-altitude reconnaissance require special endurance and character. This is obvious. I'm very pleased to have people like you. Thank you very, very much. You know your efforts are not in vain. Overall, the situation in the Special Military Operations Zone is developing favorably for us. Your fellow fighters are actively advancing on all fronts. As you know, in the cities of Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, the enemy is surrounded. First important announcement from Putin. From now on, once again, at the military hospital in Moscow, accompanied by wounded Russian soldiers in recovery. The location is very, very symbolic. The important announcements, both regarding Pokrovsk-Kupiansk, the situation on the front, and also regarding these superweapons, the successful tests of these superweapons. Putin makes these announcements alongside wounded soldiers. On more than one occasion, he emphasized that his successor would emerge from among the Russian soldiers, Russian officers, Russian military personnel, directly participating in the war in Ukraine. And now Putin's announcement begins, first regarding the situation in Pokrovsk. Attention. No, let's make some adjustments here. As you know, in the cities of Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, the enemy is surrounded. By the way, I've discussed this issue with the commanders of the respective groups. They have no objection to representatives of the media, both foreign and Ukrainian journalists, going to the area where the enemy is surrounded, so they can see with their own eyes what's happening there, assess the situation of the encircled Ukrainian troops, and so that the Ukrainian political leadership can make the appropriate decisions regarding the fate of their citizens and soldiers, as they did in Azovstal. They will have this opportunity. We are only concerned about Ukraine's reaction. We are willing to cease hostilities for a set period of time, several hours, 2, 3, 6 days, so that groups of journalists can enter these settlements, see what is happening, talk with Ukrainian soldiers, and leave. We are ready to transport them to certain locations so that the Ukrainian military on the other side can receive them. The main thing is to avoid provocations from Ukraine, so that no drone reaches these journalists, and none of them are injured. Otherwise, everyone could try to blame us for that incident. We don't need that. On the contrary, we are ready to do everything exactly as I just said. The question is whether the Ukrainian side is prepared for this. That's the first thing I wanted to say. What they're doing on the front is honorable. All right, let's pause here. This is Putin's offer, the proposal of surrender to the encircled soldiers in Pokrovsk, as well as in Kupiansk. Apparently 5,000 on each side, or 5,500 in Kupiansk and 5,000 in Pokrovsk, with practically no way out, or with the possibility of escaping through the fields under drone fire. So out of every 10 who try to flee, maybe 2 will manage a successful escape. The other 8 will end up as cannon fodder in front of the Russian drones, which monitor the area 24 hours a day. That's why Putin presented, along with the announcement of the Poseidon torpedo, this offer of a ceasefire, the entry of journalists for, in his own words, 2, 3, up to 6 days, said casually, but with the possibility that during that time the journalists could document the situation and then leave the area within the framework once again of a ceasefire. The idea was that the reports from these journalists about the inevitability of the defeat of the troops trapped there would generate media pressure for surrender, and thus prevent the deaths of those 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers.
De estos 10.000 soldados ucranianos, ¿sí? Es el ofrecimiento el día de ayer de Putin. Entrada de los medios,
It's Putin's offer from yesterday, allowing the media to enter so they can document and present this internationally. And from there, the Ukrainian High Command can decide whether to validate the surrender or reject the offer, after which Russia would begin eliminating those 10,000 soldiers. A clever proposal by Putin, because on one hand, he appears as the party interested in preserving the lives of those soldiers. In addition, it generates the dissemination of images showing the situation of the Ukrainian soldiers, not only here, but in general terms.
No solamente aquí, sino en términos generales, y por otro lado, desactiva la posibilidad de una situación como la de...
On the other hand, it rules out the possibility of a situation like the one in Azovstal, in Mariupol. Remember that? When basically the Ukrainian High Command, Zelensky above all, although at that time he was accompanied by Valery Zaluzhny as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, or before Syrsky, by the way, Valery Zaluzhny, determined that under no circumstances could those soldiers surrender. In fact, they were abandoned there. Moreover, they had, immorally, not immoral, but immoral, previously called on civilians. There were even women with children in the basements of Azovstal, due to earlier calls from the Ukrainian High Command to use them as human shields against Russian attacks.
Como escudo humano frente a los ataques rusos, ¿sí? Por eso, en aquel entonces, Rusia convalidó la salida.
That's why, at that time, Russia approved the evacuation of civilians and those few, but still, families with children before the final attack on Azovstal. The vast majority of soldiers did not surrender in Azovstal, following orders. Some did, and that caused the unnecessary deaths of many soldiers, because Azovstal already seemed surrounded. Since Putin doesn't want this to happen again, this is his proposal. Journalists, reports, evacuation, surrender, saving the lives of those 10,000 people. And, logically, in political terms as well, all of this follows the logic of geopolitics. All of this also presents and positions Putin as a party interested, in some way, in the maintenance and survival of the soldiers.
El mantenimiento de las vidas de los soldados, ¿sí? La supervivencia de los soldados. Bueno, hoy día ya respondieron desde Ucrania.
Well, today Ukraine has already responded. Kiev replied through Zelensky's spokesperson, saying that under no circumstances would Ukraine validate the entry of journalists, and that under no circumstances would Ukrainians validate the surrender in Pokrovsk. So, my friends, in recent days, in the last few hours, there have already been, mostly failed, escape attempts. And unfortunately, a massacre is beginning because of Kiev's decision, once again, a politically made decision, not to capitulate despite the unavoidable, terrible conditions of these soldiers. That's why I wanted to present Putin's words from the beginning, in full, before the announcement about the Poseidon torpedo. That's the situation in Pokrovsk.
Poseidon. Esa es la situación en Pokrovsk. Si quieren después cuando recorramos los ataques el día de ayer de Rusia.
If you want, later, when we go over yesterday's Russian attacks on Ukraine's strategic infrastructure, we can also look at Pokrovsk on the map. A little more about Putin, and now, yes, about the evidence of the superweapons. I think it's important for you to know what's happening in general along the line of contact on the front. This is how these things have developed. What you are doing, what your comrades, our soldiers and officers, are doing, is the most important task the country is carrying out right now, ensuring its security, the long-term security of our people. But just as important as this is that, while addressing these urgent and crucial issues, we don't forget to improve and strengthen our strategic potential. And here begins the announcement.
Probablemente también ya lo hayan oído. Recientemente se probó un nuevo...
You may have already heard. A new state-of-the-art missile was recently tested, with unlimited range and a nuclear propulsion system. In this case, yes, a missile, because this refers to the Burevestnik, not yet to the Poseidon torpedo. This missile offers undeniable advantages. We can be proud that the achievements of our scientists, specialists, engineers and workers made it possible. The advantage lies in the fact that it uses a compact nuclear propulsion system. Its power is comparable to that of a submarine's nuclear reactor, but it is 1,000 times smaller. 1,000 times smaller. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that, while a conventional nuclear reactor takes several hours, days, or weeks to start up, this nuclear reactor starts up in a matter of minutes or seconds. It is an extraordinary achievement.
Se trata de un logro extraordinario. Pero también podremos aplicarlo a la economía nacional en el...
But we'll also be able to apply it to the national economy in the future, to address energy security issues in the Arctic and in the lunar program. This is Putin's strategic planning. They are miniature nuclear reactors, practically with fast or immediate ignition. In fact, if I remember correctly, the Burevestnik missile has 2 reactors. A small conventional reactor for the first few seconds.
Un pequeño reactor convencional para los primeros segundos, luego, una vez en el aire, comienza así el funcionamiento.
Then, once in the air, the nuclear reactor begins to operate. Something once again unprecedented. The activation of a nuclear reactor in seconds or minutes, something that had been impossible until now. From that point on, this eternal missile, as it has been described in Russia, begins its flight through the air, also powered by a nuclear reactor with the strength of a nuclear submarine's reactor, much larger in scale. Before long, it will come into use. It will become operational in the Arctic, a future commercial route. In fact, it is already a developing trade route, but from now on, it will become increasingly so, not only for Russia, but also for China. What is the problem with habitability in the Arctic? The lack of energy. With these mini reactors, they will be able to generate that energy there.
Estos mini reactores van a poder generar esa energía allí y también van a poder generar energía en la luna.
And they're also going to be able to generate energy on the moon, right? The level of Putin's strategic planning regarding this. A bit more about Putin's announcements. Even now, radiation-hardened electronics from the Burevestnik missile are being used in space programs, which means that not only is their future use in the Arctic and on the moon being planned, but they're already functioning in those radiation-hardened systems, taken from the Burevestnik missile and already applied in space programs. Well, a bit more about Putin. This represents a significant advance, not only to strengthen the country's defense capabilities, but also for science in general and for the national economy looking toward the future.
Sino también para la ciencia en general y para la economía nacional de cara al futuro. Pero eso no es todo.
But that's not all. You should also know this. And now the third announcement begins. First about Pokrovsk, the offer, the proposal for a ceasefire, and the subsequent capitulation of the Ukrainians, saving the lives of the 10,000 soldiers trapped there. Second, the announcement about the Burevestnik. And third, now the following announcement. You should know this. Yesterday we carried out a test of another promising weapons system, the unmanned underwater vehicle Poseidon, also equipped with a nuclear power unit on board. For the first time, we managed not only to launch it using a starter engine from a carrier submarine, but also to activate a nuclear power plant, which allowed the device to operate for a certain period of time.
Funcionara durante un tiempo determinado. Esto es un gran éxito, además de todas las ventajas.
This is a great success. In addition to all the advantages I mentioned, it's also very small. The latest missile is 1,000 times smaller than a submarine's nuclear reactor. The Poseidon is 100 times smaller than a submarine's nuclear reactor. However, the power of the Poseidon significantly surpasses even that of our most advanced intercontinental range missile, the Sarmat. So, to sum it all up, the nuclear reactor of the Burevestnik missile is 1,000 times smaller than a submarine's nuclear reactor.
El reactor nuclear de un submarino nuclear y el reactor nuclear del Torpedo Poseidon.
And the nuclear reactor of the Poseidon Torpedo, 100 times smaller, well, larger, obviously, 100 times smaller than the nuclear reactor of a submarine, but with infinitely greater destructive capacity. I don't remember exactly the length of the Burevestnik missile, but it was nowhere near the size of this torpedo, 20 meters long, obviously much larger than any known missile. That's why Putin's reference is not only to its small nuclear reactor, but to its phenomenal power. more power than the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile. There is nothing like the Sarmat in the world. It's not in service yet, but it will be soon.
Nada parecido al Sarmat. Aún no está en servicio, pero lo estará pronto. Sin embargo, Poseidon supera.
However, Poseidon far surpasses Sarmat in power. Moreover, when it comes to the speed and depth of movement of this unmanned vehicle, there is nothing like it in the world, and it's unlikely that anything comparable will appear soon. There's no way to intercept it. I think this is also important for you, right? You are fighting on the front lines, risking your lives, and of course, you think about the reason for your struggle, about the country's readiness to support your actions, risking your life and health, protecting the homeland. You also think about your ability to keep moving forward, strengthening defenses, and in general, becoming stronger. These are also aspects related to this work. Thank you again. If anyone wishes to say something, please do. If not, we'll ask the journalists to step out, and then we'll speak with you heart to heart. How about it, Putin? In addition to the very important symbolic announcement made here, the possibility of a dialogue arises. If any of the soldiers want to respond or share their point of view, they can do so, but quietly, among themselves, heart to heart, right? One recalls Trump's words, Trump's attitudes, and in contrast to this, the difference is quite clear, isn't it? From every point of view. By the way, speaking of Trump, he has already reacted.
Trump ya reaccionó. Este anuncio, no solamente el Burevestnik, sino por sobre todas las cosas.
This announcement, not only about the Burevestnik, but above all, about the Poseidon torpedo, sparked reactions everywhere in the West. It triggered a wave of panic, and that's why from South Korea, where Trump was attending the ASEAN summit and holding the much-publicized meeting with Xi Jinping, even though it didn't produce any significant decision or agreement. Well, from there, desperate, Trump presented this. This is his social network, Truth Here, and these are his words translated into Spanish. The United States has more nuclear weapons than any other country.
Estados Unidos posee más armas nucleares que cualquier otro país. Esto se logró incluyendo una completa modernización y renovación.
This was achieved by including a complete modernization and renewal of the existing arsenal during my first term. Because of its tremendous destructive power, it was very difficult for me to do, but I had no other choice. Russia ranks second, and China a distant third. But the situation will even out in 5 years due to other countries' testing programs. I have therefore instructed the Department of War to begin testing our nuclear weapons on equal terms. This process will begin immediately. Thank you for your attention. President Donald J. Trump. Well, someone, right? Someone with pee in their pants, huh?
Con pipí en los pantalones, ¿sí? Por más que llame el reinicio del desarrollo.
No matter how much he calls for restarting the development of nuclear weapons, the US nuclear triad is clearly at a disadvantage compared to Russia's. It is significantly behind. First of all, it lacks hypersonic missiles. It has carried out experimental tests in numerous projects, but in none of them was it able to achieve a successful test. It has not managed to launch a hypersonic missile. Therefore, that is its first disadvantage. As for miniature nuclear reactors, there are neither torpedoes with nuclear reactors nor missiles with nuclear reactors. Or like the Burevestnik, hypersonic missiles with enormous destructive power derived solely from their kinetic energy, from their speed.
De su energía cinética, de la velocidad, o misiles como los quinzales, también hipersónicos.
Or missiles like the Kinzhal, also hypersonic, or etc., etc., etc. The Zircon as well. In this case, hypersonic cruise missiles. Well, in all these matters, the United States appears to be far behind. And just as they cannot restart the production of conventional weapons to catch up with Russia, and the entire NATO cannot produce enough weapons for the war in Ukraine against Russia, as we have already determined here on many occasions, that war seems decided, and we are now witnessing the collapse of the strategic city of Pokrovsk, of the strategic city of Kupiansk, and before long, we will see substantial Russian advances in the context of a war of attrition.
Sustanciales en el marco de una guerra de desgaste. Bueno, así como desde 2022 no pudieron reactivar.
Well, just as since 2022, they haven't been able to reactivate the military-industrial complex for the production of conventional weapons for a war like the one against Russia in Ukraine, they're even less likely to be able to reactivate the United States' strategic defense and attack capabilities overnight, based on a tweet or a post by Trump on his social network. These processes take years of development. According to military analysts, the beginning of the program for the development of the Poseidon torpedo dates back to 2010, based on previous failed projects, some as old as 1949, under Stalin.
Algunos tan antiguos como el año 1949, ¿sí? Con Stalin. De ahí la concepción inicial de estas armas.
That's where the initial concept of these weapons came from. But anyway, this Trump, his administration, basically focuses on image, on the media, on grandiose announcements. From that to actual results, well, light years apart, right? And that's why we can now show something about what happened earlier today in South Korea, where finally, after so many Trump announcements and so many tweets, posts and so on, Trump and Xi, US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping held a meeting with a conversation without any hand-pulling, right? What do you think? Xi Jinping is quite tall, by the way.
That's not good.
Siempre con un chistecito, Trump es ahí diciendo.
Always with a little joke. Trump is a very tough negotiator. That's not good for us. And that little smile, Xi Jinping there, with a little smile. Xi Jinping's smile conveys the feeling of 5,000 years of history. Trump with reality show jokes, because that's his specialty. Trump with jokes for the media, within the framework of the entertainment society. And Xi Jinping responds with 5,000 years of history, and with an unyielding, inevitable path toward global hegemony in the face of the decline of the United States and the rise of multipolarity. After this greeting, we can present a bit more, well, here without the arm pulling, like with Macron, with the weaker leaders. Trump is much more careful with those with whom we have a great relationship. We've always had a great relationship. Trump can't go a single serious second without a joke, some stupid remark. He just can't. Well, with those Trump sees as weak leaders, as subordinates, like Macron, Merkel, well, that's when he engages in those silly arm-pulling antics. With Putin, no. He shakes hands very cordially. And with Xi Jinping, the same. That's Trump, weak with the strong and strong with the weak.
Con los fuertes débil y con los débiles fuerte. Después de este saludo, realizaron.
After this greeting, they held a closed-door meeting that lasted an hour and a half. That meeting didn't produce anything. Well, after that meeting, they couldn't present a joint statement. And the only thing that came out of it was basically another post from Trump on his social network. We can show it here for a second. Folks, Trump's page, here it is. It's full of junk. He must post around 20 times a day, many of them even with memes. That's the page of the President of the United States. No more and no less. Here's his post about what happened. I had a very productive meeting with President Xi Jinping of China. There is great respect between our two countries, and what just happened will only make it stronger.
Y lo que acaba de ocurrir no hará sino fortalecerlo. Acordamos muchos puntos y otros incluso de suma importancia.
We agreed on many points, and others, even those of great importance, are very close to being resolved. I felt deeply honored that President Xi authorized China to begin purchasing large quantities of soybeans, sorghum, and other agricultural products. Our farmers will be very happy. In fact, as I already mentioned during my first term, farmers should immediately go out and buy more land and bigger tractors. I would like to thank President Xi for this. In addition, China committed to continuing the flow of rare earths, critical minerals, magnets, and so on, in an open and free manner. It is very significant that China has firmly stated it will work diligently with us to stop the flow of fentanyl into our country. They will help us put an end to the fentanyl crisis. China also agreed to begin the process of purchasing American energy. In fact, a large-scale transaction could be finalized for the purchase of oil and gas from the state of Alaska. Our energy teams will meet to discuss the possibility of reaching an energy agreement. The agreements reached today will bring prosperity and security to millions of Americans. After this historic trip to Asia, I am returning to Washington. I want to thank the great nations of Malaysia, Japan, and South Korea for their generosity. Those were the 3 stops on Trump's recently concluded Asian tour. I also want to thank Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, who attended the dinner hosted by His Excellency Lee Jae-myung at the ASEAN Summit in South Korea. Thanks to them, our country receives hundreds of billions of dollars. Our nation is strong, respected, and admired. Once again, the best is yet to come. Well, all of this is just empty talk. Specifically, from all of this, the only thing about the energy agreement was simply a mention by Trump, not even a reference from the Chinese side, just something for the future. China could buy energy from the United States, or could acquire energy from Alaska. Well, nonsense. Secondly, there's the matter of China committing to address the fentanyl issue. Another stupidity. Because remember that the fentanyl problem in the United States, this drug, this highly addictive opioid, sold as a medication, but in many cases turned into a very strong addictive drug. And with, above all among Trump voters in the American Midwest, ghost towns, zombie towns, with a fentanyl epidemic. They call it the fentanyl crisis. This prescription drug, but more addictive than heroin. Well, the fentanyl problem is not due to the supply of the chemical precursors needed for its production, which is generally done either within the United States or near its borders. And if you want a reference, remember the series, one of the best series, by the way, of recent times, Breaking Bad, in which they basically show the method of production, not of fentanyl, but of methamphetamines. But more or less, the logic is the same. Small production units that receive inputs from different places, industrial inputs. That's why many of these inputs are produced in China, not because the Chinese want fentanyl production in the United States, but because they manufacture all kinds of industrial inputs. Well, the problem stems from the demand of US society, within the context of a broken society, broken under the hyper-individualism promoted by neoliberal society, by neoliberal hegemony. That's about fentanyl. Again, nonsense. Nothing concrete.
Otra vez una estupidez, nada en concreto. Después, ¿qué otra cosa más puesta aquí?
Then what else did they add here? Well, just that. Supposedly, this thing about China committing to continue the flow of rare earths. In reality, the Chinese had already partially reactivated the flow of rare earths. The escalation was started by the West, and the United States in particular, with the interruption of chip shipments, semiconductors, especially the most advanced ones, which are very necessary in China. They still can't produce semiconductors, at least not on a large scale. In their most advanced configurations, the 4 and 3 nanometer ones, they can already make up to 7 nanometer chips for Chinese phones. According to many analysts, they might already be producing 6 and 5 nanometer ones as well. But this comes at a very high cost. Obviously, China wants to buy these already produced chips, not take on the development and all that additional expense. That's how this tug-of-war began. China responded by cutting off rare earth exports. The Americans reacted with desperation, because without rare earths, they can't do anything at all. And China controls 80% of global rare earth processing and 70% of the resources. Well, they restarted it through an agreement a few weeks ago. And the announcement, by the way, of China's purchase of US soybeans is related to the same issue, following the latest wave of tariffs announced by Trump. What did China decide? Well, enough of American soybeans. So the Americans corrected course, Trump backed down, And then the Chinese fulfilled their purchase promise of, if I remember correctly, 180 million tons of American soybeans, much less than before. For some time now, China has been redirecting its soybean purchases, which are essential for food in the country, especially for pork production. Soybeans have a high caloric content, which is why they're used as feed, as balanced food for pigs. With the reduction of poverty and the increase in Chinese workers' income, the consumption of pork and other meats has shown growth, a rapid increase, hence the need for soybeans.
Avance, un aumento acelerado, por eso la necesidad de soja. Y ya comenzó China desde hace tiempo un giro.
And China already began some time ago a shift toward Brazilian and Argentine soybeans. So all these announcements are a farce. In 2 days, Trump will either backtrack or reverse what he said and will impose new sanctions against China. That's why Xi Jinping's little smile. You guys with your back and forths, announcements and counter-announcements. Meanwhile, we're in full growth and full military development as well. This is Xi Jinping's response. Demolishers, please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship. In just a moment, Adrian Zelaya's broadcast will begin. I haven't made the cover yet. I'll make it right away.
Todavía no generé la portada, la voy a generar inmediatamente ahora, después del final de esta transmisión.
Now, after the end of this broadcast, once again, our thanks to the demolishers, both men and women, who took part the day before yesterday in the gathering here in Buenos Aires. A success, a lot of people, really very, very pleasant. From now on, we'll surely hold more gatherings in that same place, just like our meetings in Madrid, in Bogotá, wherever life takes us. We're going to hold gatherings with you, demolishers, because all our effort is for you. Tomorrow we'll be back with our usual programming, so we look forward once again to reuniting tomorrow, Friday. Demolishers, we love you very much. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Los queremos muchísimo. Hasta el día de mañana. Chao.